Welcome. Today, we look into a thriving culture of tech startups, and not in Silicon Valley, actually closer to the Jordan Valley, the tech renaissance in the Arab world. Also on the program, how to regulate the internet so it stays free, open, and innovative. This involves the FCC and four more Cs, the courts, Congress, consumers, and corporations. Then we'll take another look at GMOs, genetically modified organisms, foods, which probably include your dinner. The dangers of GMOs are vastly underestimated, says the guest in our public intellectual segment. And towards the end of the hour, we'll meet an 85-year-old artist who's been preserving New York City on canvas and in her heart. But to begin, a high-tech renaissance in a part of the world where we hear mostly about trouble. From Cairo to Beirut, from Amman to Dubai, tech startups are thriving in the Arab world. To get an inside look, here's a condensed video of a competition held in Cairo this spring by the MIT Enterprise Forum.
It's been a very pleasant surprise to see so many startups across the whole region pitching a very wide, different sort of types of services.
I've been working with other people from all over the world, especially in the Middle East.
We were just inside pitching to the round 2 judges.
We had to go to 3 different judges, very diverse judges, and we had to pitch our idea. And we had 10 minutes to pitch and answer questions, and I think it was awesome.
A high-speed glimpse of the MIT Enterprise Forum in Cairo. How and why did this Arab tech movement get started? With us on Skype from Beirut, Joelle Yazbeck, Program Manager of MIT's Enterprise Forum Pan-Arab Region. Joanne, welcome, and hello from New York.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Joelle, is there a tech renaissance in North Africa and the Middle East? Would you use that term?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's an entrepreneurship and innovation revolution, if I can say that. So just a little bit of background. So in 2009, the Middle East and North African region had witnessed a big success story, and it started with the acquisition of Yahoo for Maktub, which is an Arabic portal, for $165 million. And this has been a success story for the whole Arab region. And later that year, in end 2009, early 2010, a big gathering of entrepreneurship and innovation happened in Dubai, gathering around 5,000 people, all speaking the same language of entrepreneurship and innovation. Everyone wants to start their own businesses, and no one was talking politics nor other stuff. And later, after this big gathering, Tunisia, Yemen, and Egypt, they witnessed the Arab Spring, what we call now is the Arab Spring, and the political leaders, they started falling one after the other, and a lot of economic problems and social problems, they have been rising, and the young generation, mostly of the entrepreneurs, the only way to find solutions for those problems was for them to think outside of the box and to start thinking of how we can solve those solutions. And the only way to get there was starting startups that would solve those opportunities.
You give a lot of credit, I see, to a woman named Hala Fadel. Who is she?
She's the person who started the MIT Enterprise Forum 8 years ago. She's an MIT alum herself, and she participated in a startup competition called the MIT 100K on campus. She won that competition back then. She started her company and sold it. And when she got back to the region, she felt that the best way to mobilize the youth with all the talent that they have is to run and start a startup competition. So I joined on board in 2006, and together we launched the MIT Arab Startup Competition, which is considered one of the largest entrepreneurship programs across the Middle East and North Africa, receiving around 5,000 applications each year, which means mobilizing 13 to 15,000 entrepreneurs each year, and creating success stories. And the success stories, they have ranged from businesses related to healthcare, environment, education, mobile apps, etc.
I'll pick up on one of the phrases that you used in that answer, to mobilize all the talent that was there or that they have. And I read that there was a lot of talent, a lot of creative energy in Beirut in particular, that nobody was being, nobody was really putting to use. Was Beirut a hub of tech creativity, and therefore it was ripe to start there?
Well, actually, Beirut is still definitely the hub, and others and other countries. I think they started to embrace this culture of creativity and innovation. But definitely Beirut, since the beginnings. I mean, like, this country has been facing a lot of political instability, and corruption, and something like more than 30 years. And the Lebanese people are known for being, for their education. They're known for being entrepreneurs themselves and finding solutions for those problems. So yes, Beirut was the start, and during that year it was kind of a local competition, but then we just thought that the whole region should benefit from this, and we went pan-Arab from year 2. And every year when we get applications, we get from 21 countries, no exception.
So there's this concept that a generation of political strife like Lebanon has had might actually create a condition in which entrepreneurship would thrive rather than kind of beat the life out of people?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's the only way. So I like the way Christopher Schroeder, he's the author of Arab Startup Rising, the book that he wrote in 2011, and he says that every opportunity is a software opportunity for those guys. So whenever you find a problem, the way you think about it is, let's do a startup that addresses that problem.
Fascinating. Let's show a minute on video of the woman, Hala Fadel, who so inspired you and brought you on board. Here it is.
Command like a king, because it does take some leadership skills to start a business. There is very little you can do on your own. And engaging and motivating people to work with you requires as much leadership skills as a king during war times. Create like a god. In today's environment, everything is open to competition. The minute you start thinking of a new idea, someone else is already working on it. As Thomas Friedman puts it, the world is flat. There is no place to hide. So you'd better shoot for the moon and create like gods from day one. And once you've created your own company, once you're your own boss, my God, what a feeling of satisfaction and pride.
That's just about a minute of full TED Talk from the TEDx Beirut conference, one of them. Do you want to say anything about those ideas that we just heard?
So this is exactly what Hala talked about, the leadership and commanding, working hard. So basically, when we receive proposals from entrepreneurs, the main criteria that we look at, number one, is the team and their leadership skills, and then we look at scalability. So the proposition, the business that they are proposing, it has to have a global potential. Otherwise, it doesn't qualify for later stages. And finally, it's all about innovation, creativity, and this is what she addresses in her second point. It doesn't have to. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but probably it could be re-engineering a process or just improving a certain user experience. So team, leadership, scalability, and innovation is what we look for when we are screening proposals.
I understand you have a little different ratio of men to women in Arab world startups than we do in the United States. Is that true? And now, yes, it's actually much higher than the States. So I think in the States, the women participation in the startup is something around 10%. So when we started 8 years ago, this number in the Middle East has improved from 15% now until 40%, and that includes 1/3 of the winners each year are women. How do you account for that difference? That's such a difference between 10% in the United States and 1/3 up to 40% in the Arab world. Most Americans would think of the Arab world as particularly hostile to women's rights, women's freedom, to do such a thing.
I mean, exactly. It's because of all this, you know, like all the problems that women face here in the region. I mean, like if you look at Saudi, women are still not allowed to drive, and it's very difficult for women to start their own businesses. But because they want to start their own business, they try to find another way, you know, to do it. So, for instance, all e-commerce businesses in Saudi started by women. They all started on Instagram. So the only way was that to benefit from the technology that they found. So if they were like doing any type of crafts or fashion, they would take pictures and put them on Instagram, and this is how they would grow their business and start selling. I think it's all about, you know, whenever you find we're breaking just out of the traditions and breaking the norms and trying to find problems for the solution. And we're not just looking at the solution as being as a problem, but rather find solutions to work around.
I'm thinking of the Saudi leadership sitting around, and maybe the clerical leadership with them, and they're saying, we don't allow women to drive, but we allow them to code. Big mistake. Is there, I also read that there's kind of a cultural, and I have no idea if this is true, so you tell me, that the cultural tradition would be against entrepreneurship. People would be more likely to look for jobs. So you had to start training people through your organization to think in an entrepreneurial fashion. Is there any truth to that?
Exactly. This was the case actually when we started. So entrepreneurship was a new notion, you know, and actually it was against the culture here in the region. So when someone graduated, the parents, they would just expect them to take on, you know, a stable job, where being a doctor or maybe a lawyer or an engineer, you know. But entrepreneurship, like starting your own business, is very risky, and why would you do that? Plus, the cost of failure is really very high, you know. So you'll be like, you at the end of the day, if you fail, you're disappointing your family, and you're disappointing your friends and your relatives and everyone, all your circle of friends. So, right, it was very difficult for us when we started 8 years ago, but the way we went about it, you know, is that we started promoting role models that speak to the Arab entrepreneurs and to the Arab generation. So, for instance, we used to highlight like Fadi Gandour. He's the founder of Aramex, which is the equivalent of FedEx in the MENA region. He's someone who he's Jordanian. He started this company. He's Lebanese Jordanian. Actually, he started this company on his own. You know, he built it from zero, and he's a role model for the region. So we've come a long way since 8 years, and now entrepreneurship is being taught at universities, and every conference or every gathering that happens, it tackles entrepreneurship, you know, from an angle of creating jobs, from an angle of unleashing innovation, from an angle of finding solutions for
Yes.
Societal and infrastructural problems.
Well, it's really exciting, and I hope you continue to develop. As long as New York gets all the tech jobs and successful startups that it wants, after that, good luck to you in Beirut and Cairo and throughout the Arab world. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you so much.
Shortly after that political blow landed a few weeks back, when the Democrats lost control of the Senate, President Obama came out swinging, not just on immigration reform, which you've heard a lot about, but on net neutrality. In a White House video, the president warned the nation that the free and open internet we use to communicate and to shop and whatever else you do on the internet is in danger from corporate control if the Federal Communications Commission doesn't protect it.
To put these protections in place, I'm asking the FCC to reclassify Internet service under Title II of a law known as the Telecommunications Act. In plain English, I'm asking them to recognize that for most Americans, the Internet has become an essential part of everyday communication and everyday life. The FCC is an independent agency, and ultimately this decision is theirs alone. But the public has already commented nearly 4 million times, asking the FCC to make sure that consumers, not the cable company, gets to decide which sites they use.
President Obama's critics argue that the internet is not a public utility like he framed it there, like electricity or water, and that the FCC should proceed with a light touch and trust the marketplace to grow the net. With us to dig into the ideology, politics, and legal questions behind the debate are Geoffrey Manne, founder of the International Center for Law and Economics, who joins us via Skype from Portland, Oregon. And joining me in the flesh here in our studio is Tim Karr, Senior Director of Strategy for the activist group Free Press. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having me.
And Mr. Manne, let me ask you first to react to the president's framing there, because he put it as a question of each individual internet user being able to decide what websites we use rather than the cable companies or the other internet service providers from which we buy our internet access. Do you not accept that kind of dichotomy, that either-or framing?
Yeah, no, not particularly. I think a couple of key things are, number one, the fight is not really about net neutrality per se. And of course, the president requested the FCC to adopt Title II to regulate the internet in order to achieve these net neutrality objectives. And we should be clear that that's where the discussion is. Everyone agrees that we should have a free and open internet, and we all probably agree generally on the sorts of principles that should govern the internet. The real question is this very narrow legal question about how we should go about achieving that. And it was saying things like a user should be able to access any content they want. No one disputes that. The real question is what sort of business arrangements should be allowed on the internet in order to ensure that consumers are able to get exactly what they want.
What sort of business arrangements do you think should be allowed, and are there any that you think shouldn't be allowed in order to preserve that basic value?
Yeah, well, the key has come down to this question of so-called paid prioritization. And even that is a little bit of an ambiguous term, and we can unpack that. But generally speaking, I believe that we should have, and net neutrality, Title II proponents, the strongest net neutrality proponents, don't believe we should have paid prioritization deals, arrangements between content providers and ISPs that might prioritize some content over others. That can take a lot of different forms. It can look like T-Mobile's recent streaming music service that prioritizes music bits over other sorts of bits, or it can look like something like the kind of deals Netflix has now entered into with Comcast and Verizon, and has entered into for many years, where it prioritizes its content. It gets service-level agreements to ensure that its bits are delivered with the kind of quality that its consumers demand because of the type of content and the amount of volume that it produces. The limit should be, for me, the limit would be anti-competitive arrangements. The thing is that when it comes to this kind of vertical arrangement, which is what these are, the economic evidence is very clear, and the antitrust authorities have long understood that they're generally pro-competitive. That doesn't mean they always are, but they're generally pro-competitive. And unless and until you can really demonstrate that one of these kinds of arrangements will very likely lead to harm to consumers, the appropriate approach is to allow them, subject to a rebuttable presumption, that they are legal, unless you can reach some threshold that says, hey, this actually looks like a problematic example and perhaps shouldn't be allowed, even though in general they should be allowed.
Right. Okay. So let me bring Tim Karr in here, and let me back off one step for people not up to speed on the net neutrality debate, and say that part of what I was just talking about with the other guest has to do with corporations' ability to buy their way to faster speeds to our computers by paying an extra fee to the internet service providers like the cable companies. And the president says this should not be allowed. The other guest says, yeah, it should be allowed under the law, but when you get into some particular anti-competitive monopoly situation where consumers are really disadvantaged and really don't have a choice, then on a case-by-case basis, then you go and knock that down. Why so bad?
Well, you need to understand that internet access in the United States is mostly governed by anti-competitive monopolies. A company like Comcast, for example, which is in the process of trying to acquire the second largest cable internet provider, Comcast being the largest, is also in the business of providing other sorts of service. Comcast is a cable company. It has a streaming video service. So it is in their interest to stifle competition along those lines. You'll also find that phone companies like AT&T and Verizon have an interest in stifling competitors that provide voice over internet protocol. And there's an actual history of this kind of discrimination happening. And I think it's really important to point out here that this is often framed as Title II would transform a company like Comcast into a public utility. That's not what we're asking for.
The president did talk about public utilities.
Yes, but
you're saying it would be different from the water company or the electric company.
Well, understanding of a public utility is that it's oftentimes government owned, if not government controlled. It's rate regulated to control prices. There's a universal service requirement as well. Net neutrality in Title II is...
So like the energy companies.
Like an energy company or water company.
They have a requirement to provide service to everybody, but they're private companies, right?
Right.
In New York City, we get our
and
energy
what we're looking
distributed by Con Ed.
Right. What we're looking at very specifically here is the issue of non-discrimination, and that is preventing against the sort of paid prioritization that Geoffrey favors, which is to say that decision, the decision of what services we use, at what speed we receive them, should reside in the hands of the consumers. We do have a choice as consumers. Some of us can buy a DSL service or a cable service if we're lucky enough. Few of us have access to Fios. We make that decision and we strike a deal with our internet service provider to provide us with that data at that speed. That should be the end of the arrangement. Now, what Verizon and others have been arguing for is like they want to go then to Netflix and other corporations and strike another deal whereby they will prioritize certain content over others. Now, the problem is that completely re-engineers the way the internet was meant to be. The way that the internet has become such a useful tool, and I would say it's not a utility, but infrastructure that is essential to our society, because it has allowed for this level playing field for anyone to go online, any company to go online and compete without having to first pay for prioritization in order to succeed.
Mr. Manne, what do you think of that argument?
Well, I think it's incorrect to say that the internet isn't structured, isn't engineered to allow for prioritization. It's very clear that from the very beginning, there have been protocols on the internet that allow for prioritization. They're one of the few sets of protocols that were that have been migrated over into IPv6 because they're so important, they're so essential for the proper management of the internet. So at the most basic level, it's very clear that we've never had a sort of purely neutral internet. And that's not just with respect to the protocol and the engineering, it's also true with respect to the kinds of connections to the internet. So Netflix, for example, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, all of these companies connect either through their own or occasionally through others' CDNs, content distribution networks. And they manage to thereby prioritize their bits over other bits that may come in through less favored sorts of connections. And there are many examples like that. And we think that works really well. In fact, in the 2010 effort to impose net neutrality rules, there were very clear, very explicit exceptions for a whole range of that kind of thing, of that kind of prioritization that exists on the internet, that has existed on the internet from the beginning, and that clearly is beneficial to consumers. So now what we're doing is sort of saying, we're shifting this presumption. We're saying we're going to presume that all these forms of prioritization are bad unless you jump through some set of hoops, and it's not clear what those hoops are or whether there will actually be any hoops, to demonstrate that in fact it's not bad. But that actually is the thing that shifts the internet on its head. The internet has always operated under an assumption of some degree of prioritization.
So what's your nightmare scenario here if the FCC overregulates? How do consumers lose?
Well, I suppose the number one most obvious nightmare is a reduction in the incentives for the ISPs and, for that matter, content providers that do operate these CDNs and other aspects of the internet backbone to invest in both building and also in maintaining and upgrading that infrastructure. If they can't realize a sufficiently high level of return, then I think there's this strong reason to think that they won't do it. Actually, the best piece of evidence for this, I think, is the fact that companies like Cisco, that are equipment makers, who are not themselves ISP, who don't stand in that potentially problematic position that Tim described.
Right, they make the physical infrastructure of the internet, Cisco.
Right. Exactly, and they are very strongly opposed to Title II. I think that's a very strong indication. They are an input provider into the internet. Their primary interest is in expanding output,
right.
And they very firmly believe Title II will restrict output.
So, Tim Karr, how do you respond to that, and what's your nightmare scenario if the FCC underregulates?
Well, first on the issue of investment, there is no conclusive data that shows that investment from ISPs dries up as a result of this regulatory oversight. In fact, we looked at DSL and other internet service providers at a time when Title II was required. Title II was taken away as a regulatory framework during the Bush administration of the FCC, and we found that their investment was in fact larger. The kind of capital investment that they would make to build out larger networks was larger. So a lot of that investment rhetoric is a scare tactic designed to make you think that these companies are somehow suffering. It's worthwhile also to mention that cable companies in their broadband internet services make profit margins between 80 and 90%. These companies are not going out of business, and in fact they have told their investors that Title II will not damage their shareholder price in any significant way. So therefore there's a lot of this kind of rhetoric, and what we're really trying to do is protect a network that allows not just phone and cable companies to profit, but one that allows those who use the network to profit as well, so that you have companies like, this is the common analogy, like, you know, Google was started by two doctorate students at Stanford. Other people have started businesses over their garage or in a cafe shop and a coffee shop. And so that was made possible because you have this presumption that once you get online, you can access the whole universe. Everyone online can connect at a fairly equal level to one another. So our greatest fear is that this network, which has been an incredible engine, not just for economic growth, but for political organizing, for free speech, will be compromised in a way that will allow a handful of companies, the few companies that provide phone and cable access in the United States, to dictate the future of communications. What President Obama is calling for, what we've been calling for, Title II is not a regulation of the internet. I want to say that again. It is not a regulation of the internet. It is a regulation of internet service providers, companies like Comcast and AT&T, and they are no more the internet than a company like Georgia Pacific are the forests. But it protects users of the internet against the types of abuses that they have spoken about implementing should there be a lack of rules.
All right, Geoffrey, 30 seconds, a final word on this, and of course we're going to leave it unresolved here today.
Unfortunately, true. I think I would just say that the evidence that of the kind of harm that Tim described is essentially non-existent, which is precisely why I think we should be looking at case-by-case, rule of reason, sort of ex post kind of analysis here. There might arise situations like he describes, but they've never have, and there's no evidence to suggest that they really will. But if they do, the FCC isn't rendered powerless to deal with those by any stretch if they don't adopt Title II. The real concern is that if they do adopt Title II, the internet of the future that we don't even know what business arrangements will lead to it, that will be precluded right from the get-go.
All right, a strong disagreement between our two guests, representative of the strong disagreement in Washington over this issue. We'll see what the FCC does and if Congress steps in to overrule anything the FCC does. Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Time for Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change minds and public policy. It's been 20 years since the genetically modified flavor savor tomato hit store shelves. Today, GMOs abound. Roughly 90% of the corn and soybeans produced in the United States are genetically modified. No disasters yet. Does that mean we should conclude that GMOs are absolutely safe for the ecosystem and global health? Our guest says no way. It depends on how you do the analysis. We ought to be applying something called the precautionary principle to the GMO debate, he says. Here to explain what that is, physicist and systems scientist Yaneer Bar-Yam. He joins us via Skype from Massachusetts. Welcome. Hello from New York.
Hi. Pleased to be with you.
So let's go right to the nightmare scenario. What's the worst that could happen if we let genetically modified foods proliferate on our plates?
So the main two areas where risks are present is in ecological problems and in human health. How to evaluate how severe it can get is difficult, but in principle, it could be quite severe.
So in an ecological setting, I know you talk about blight. There are blights that occur on natural crops all the time. Something happens, there's a shortage of tomatoes or grapefruits or something in one year, and then they come back. But you have a different kind of scenario in mind if blight occurs with a genetically modified, engineered crop, correct?
Yes. Well, there are two issues, really. One is that we're basically having a single crop be providing a huge fraction of the global supply of food. And the second is that there is modification of the genetics of the crop, enabling changes in the ecological system that can cause not only problem with respect to that particular food, but with respect to other aspects of the ecology. There are many different mechanisms that might take place, and in fact, that's really the problem, that we don't really have a solid understanding of all the mechanisms of propagation. So, for example, even simple things like the fact that we're changing the interaction between the plants and the parasites in a system can result in cascades through the ecology of the agricultural system.
So in other words, something that we create as human beings, that's a plant that's so resistant to parasites, for example, might wind up proliferating wildly more than we can control and killing off a lot of other species, that kind of thing?
Yes, but it might even happen in secondary places. So, for example, in the parasites and their interactions with other parts of the ecosystem, the ecologies that we are part of are interdependent webs of various different kinds of organisms that we have some understanding of, but surely we haven't been able to understand completely how they function.
Right. But why wouldn't that be too much of a Chicken Little scenario or genetically modified tomato little scenario where we assume the worst about our ability to control our inventions? Humans are very creative and resourceful, and if scientists can come up with this, maybe we don't start with the most conservative assumption, that everything could go wrong and the planet will be destroyed or the ecosystem will be put horribly out of balance, as opposed to starting with a more optimistic scenario. Do you have models on which you measure these things?
Well, so the main problem actually today is that the entire domain of genetically modified organisms is basically untested. There is an assumption by the regulators that it's basically like any other, like breeding of plants that doesn't require any kind of testing at all. So in fact, the current situation is based upon an assumption that there is no risk, that there is no way that potential harm can propagate across the system, despite the fact that there are many historical cases where there are major reevaluations of what we've done to the environment, as well as the fact that we really are in a changing world with rapid dependencies that can propagate things globally, as we saw with the financial crisis, as we're seeing today with the risks associated with Ebola, And as we see with global terrorism, there are just many different ways that things propagate globally that we don't have an advanced knowledge of. We seem to be surprised on a regular basis. And that surprise is actually due to the fact that we are inherently assuming that the experience that we've had in the past is a very good predictor
Yes.
of what we're going to have in the future.
It's interesting that your comparisons include the financial crisis and terrorism, because these are non-biological examples, and you're not a botanist or a biologist, right?
Well, it's not entirely true. I mean, I have a fair number of papers published on biology and cell biology, on regulatory systems within biology, as well as on biodiversity and the origins of species and on evolution. So while I don't think that it's necessary to be a biologist to understand that risks are changing, and that it's really what we're talking about is fundamentally about risks, it's not quite right to say that I don't have understanding of biology.
But still, you do compare the risks here to risks in non-biological systems like the banking system and terrorism. Why are those analogies valid when you cross over out of the biological realm?
Well, the real problem is what is now popularly called black swan events. Really, it's about understanding the properties of rare events in systems. So a black swan, the idea is you go out and you see 100 swans and they're white, but maybe someday you see a black swan and it all of a sudden surprises you that that's possible. More generally, rare events, things that are not present every day, are hard for people to conceptualize. But what describes them is the statistics of distributions that we encounter in the world. And traditionally, statistics assumes that things are independent in a way, independent at a local scale, in a way that makes the large behavior satisfy what's called the normal distribution. A normal distribution, basically what you've seen, if you've seen 100 events, is basically what you should expect to see in the future. But when you have dependencies in a system, then you have long tail or fat tail distributions. And that means that rare events are much more likely than in the case of a normal distribution. And fundamentally, that means that what you've seen, if you've seen 100 days or 1,000 days, it's not necessarily the same as what you will see on the next day. You can have a quite different event that will happen. And those events tend to surprise people, which is what we're seeing. So again, all of this holds together when you do the analysis mathematically, when you have systems where there are dependencies, you have propagating cascades, and those cascades become the tail events of the fat tail distribution.
Yes.
And because you have those, you get surprised because they weren't what you saw yesterday.
So you're laying out a probability argument, a probability scenario, and you have this concept of precautionary principle. Does that mean be cautious in the things that you unleash upon the world that simply, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, let's say that it's more complicated only in the sense that risks that people take as individuals are not really the same as risks that we take as a species. When there are people that are risk averse and there are people that are risk seekers, and that's something that we can reasonably tolerate. But when policymakers take risks that put the whole world in danger, that's a different story. And sometimes they don't recognize the difference between those two different kinds of risks. We talk about this in terms of what's called ruin problems. When a classic example is a gambler that takes risks. You can show that with certain kinds of risks that people take, even if the risk is small, say 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, you do it over and over again, and you're eventually guaranteed that you will go bankrupt. And in the case of the world, it means that even if you take a risk 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 times, so that each of the risks seems very reasonable, you keep doing it, and we just won't be around for much longer. And that's really where the precautionary principle holds. In other words, it's a statement about the nature of the risk of total ruin, not a statement about smaller risks that we can tolerate because they're recoverable if the harm that we are taking the risk for actually happens.
So in our last few seconds, is there a policy proposal that you come out of your examination of risk with? Is it a ban on genetically modified organisms? Is it something else?
I think it's quite clear that with genetically modified organisms, we have to dramatically reduce the level of risk that we're taking. Now, there may be ways in local places that we can evaluate genetically modified organisms, but the approach that's being taken now of simply saying, hey, let's just do it, you know, it's just, this is exactly the circumstance where we're taking global risks, where we don't understand the nature of the harm that is being caused in a context where things propagate and cascade globally, which is what we've seen. There was a great last comment. There was a great statement about how careful we are to prevent not just genetically modified organisms, but organisms from other countries from going into agricultural places, like in California. There are tremendous regulations about bringing anything in from the outside. And here we're just kind of randomly basically creating organisms and throwing them into the wild. And
seeing what happens. Well, thank you for sharing your research with us. We appreciate it.
Take care.
Next up, time-lapse painting, portraits of an ever-changing New York City. For decades, she's been out on the sidewalks of New York, capturing the fleeting scenery with the stroke of a brush. One woman creating a time capsule, painting portraits of a city that won't stand still. She signs her work, Hedy Pegromansky, and she's here to let us see the city through her eyes. Hedy, welcome.
Thank you.
And I'm going to put an image of yours right up, and we'll talk about it, and then we'll back off and talk about your work in general.
Okay.
So let's see our first slide of one of your works, and tell us what this is.
That was one of the most
Station?
important, yes. A friend of ours who has also been a mentor to me, because she knows so much more about art than I do. And she said, you've got to make a social statement. We're losing people. The homeless are either going to be hidden away, or we're going to learn how to make life so that people can have productive work and places to live in. And she said, you know, that isn't going to happen. So quickly do this before it disappears. So I took sketches that I had made, and I did this painting of Penn Station upstairs. And for example, do you see on the left side, there's a woman with a white headscarf, and she's eating something? Well, I saw her in a construction site on a Sunday when nobody was working.
Oh, sitting on the bench. I'm just directing our viewers' eye. Near the lower left-hand corner, a woman sitting on the bench with a brown coat and a white headscarf, kind of leaning forward, almost with a hunchback, putting something in her mouth.
She found a castaway hamburger or something, and she was wolfing it down. And the woman over here, somebody sat down. When I do these drawings, nobody notices me. I wear dark clothes, and I carry this, which looks like a book. And she said to me, a woman sat down next to me, and she said, do you know what you're drawing? And I said, no, tell me. And she said, I'm a social worker. And what happens is these people live in one room with a little refrigerator and a little stove, and then the building gets torn down, and they can't afford rentals anywhere else in New York. And they pack their bags, and she's housekeeping. She would take a dish or something from one bag, polish it, and then put it into the other bag. And the one who spoke to me as a social worker, she said, suddenly they begin to do house cleaning things with the feeling that they're
Without a
keeping
home.
Yes.
Without a home.
Yes.
When was this particular painting done?
This painting took me about 5 years because I did it in
Wow.
between commissions. I finished it in 2000.
In 2000.
Yes.
So
but-
let's commute up just a little bit. It would be one stop on the subway from Penn Station to
Oh,
Times
okay.
Square.
Here is, again, I do a homeless person and everything, but this is, I did this, I wanted to put in people whom I loved. So in the red truck, we had a framing gallery, and that's my husband Eric driving the truck. And next to it are the three Durst brothers.
Real estate moguls.
Yes, who became very dear friends because, well, it's the way New York happens. You sit on a street corner and you meet the right people. And they had taken me up Seymour in the corner, who is in the painting you just saw, because he was very concerned about the plight of homeless people. And he used to write letters to the street news. So he was in the one you just saw. The only real painting in there. There he is on the corner in the light suit. And when I didn't know how to do the top of that big sign that you see with the back of it, and my mind is not mechanical, and I couldn't figure out what of the many thousands of pieces of wood or wires to do. So he took me up to Artcraft Strauss, and they taught me how to do so much in showing a panorama. They said, since your angles will never be right, you stand there and you take a photograph, or you do the picture, and then you go right next to it, you do another one, and then pretty soon you have a panorama.
And you go.
So I learned from everybody.
Now they have panoramic lenses.
Yes, but my eyes need to cheat in such a way that my hand allows me to fool you.
Here is a picture of you next, I believe. Is this you painting down there?
Yes. And would you believe that everybody tells me things? If they don't tell me their life story, they tell me what I'm doing wrong. Lady, you didn't put in the window right. I get a lot of critics.
And what makes them, I'm sure you get a lot of flattery and praise too.
Only towards the end. At the beginning, I remember the first time a woman walked up to me, and I'll never forget this. She patted me on the shoulder and she said, "It's good you keep busy."
What, yes, and that's not a way of saying you're making great art.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right, let's take another view of another one. What's this?
Oh, this was fun to do. Okay, let's start off on the left-hand corner, okay? That's Mr. McGreen, who ran the Bowery Savings Bank, who gave me my first exhibit. No, this over here was the teacher in the Educational Alliance of the sculpture class. Okay. And he let me sit in the sculpture class and paint from there so that I could get a whole panorama. Margaret is one of the greatest teachers I ever had. She worked next to me when we were painting little cups and things. We painted flowers and things. That was before I dared to ever go on the street. But she taught me so much. Okay, Professor Wolf, who wrote a book of synagogues of the Lower East Side, which I really used like a Bible, and the lady next to him, Renee, was a photographer. That was me. A long time ago, I made myself skinny. And that was my husband, Eric, also a long time ago. Now he is 89, and I'm 85, so we don't look that way. Here is my mother, who was a volunteer in the hospitals until she was 96. She passed away 13 years ago. Our dog, my son, whom you met outside, our daughter, and if you keep going, there's another dog there too.
And there, I don't know if we can back off to see that whole painting again, but
it's the Lower East Side.
It's typical of what we've seen so far. There are so many different people, just so many humans
The people
in
are all
most
real.
of your paintings.
They're all real. My son asked me once, many, many years after I was doing these paintings, Mom, why do you only paint real people? And he's a psychotherapist, so he knew when to ask me so that I would think of an answer that I had never realized before. When I was a little girl, I was 8 years old in Vienna when Hitler entered. And we're Jewish, so suddenly there was terror and fear. And we did escape 6 months later. But during that time, I used to think I was being hidden. If they knew us, they wouldn't hurt us. Many years later, when Eric and I were married, Eric was a concentration camp survivor. 2 years after liberation, we were married. And people would ask him, they still do, how could people do to others what they did in a concentration camp? And his answer was always, it's very easy. You just have to consider them subhuman. You have to not realize that they're real, and then you can do anything.
Unfortunately, that's the case,
Yes,
and it still goes on.
It still is. It always has been. So I didn't know until Kenny asked me that question that I need to say we exist because we are all so special.
With a very broad definition of we, in your case. We exist. We, all these people.
Everyone.
Homeless people in all of your paintings and everyone else.
I have hundreds and hundreds of sketches of people whom nobody will ever see.
One more image of yours. And we've done Times Square, we've done Penn Station, Lower East Side. This is Union Square, isn't it?
This was a powerful thing in my life because I used to go to Barnes & Nobles a lot because you could read.
The Union Square one?
Right. And they have a coffee shop. And from the coffee shop, you could see this enormous panorama. And Barnes & Noble is a very friendly store. So I took a board, an illustration board, and I drew all of the background. And then I went down into the street. I put it on the canvas, went down into the street, and I began to paint. And if you can, okay, all these people are real. But at that time it was wonderful because Eric once said, Hetty, you need to keep some paintings. From now on, when you go into the street to paint, if anybody wants to buy the painting, say no. It's not for sale, but we're going to make prints, lithographs, and whoever buys one is in the painting. So
you used to sell the original as soon as you finished it,
No.
and that was that?
After this, no.
Yes.
After this, no. But we did make prints, and that was wonderful. So all these people are real, but we were sitting, I sat on the corner by the subway in order to do Broadway at that time, to go do a close-up because I needed to see closer. And as I sat there, people got used to me because I'm there so often. And they would always come and see, what did you do and what's it like now? And an airplane went by. And somebody said, this crazy, airplanes don't pass here.
Uh-oh.
And minutes later,
I know where this is
a
going.
cell phone rang from one of them. And he yelled, oh no, oh God, no, oh no, no, no. And he ran into Broadway, which was right there. And we all ran after him. And to this day, you see, this shows what it looked, what the World Trade Center looks like from Barnes & Noble's coffee shop. But when you are sitting by the subway, it's directly in front.
And here is one more image, which was an after shot.
This was from the drawing that I made, and the painting which I did is such a joyous painting. It's such a joyous area, and color makes me explode. But it didn't feel right, so I went back to the drawing, and I made drawings of shadowy people, nobody real, holding the signs.
After 9/11.
After 9/11, holding names of people. Did you see so-and-so? Have you heard so-and-so? So the two really go together.
From our darkest hour to many of our lightest hours. a beautiful series of representations of our city.
Thank you.
At many, many times. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's our show for today. We're here each week at this hour with a new program, and do tune into my radio show weekday mornings at 10 on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.